Good day and welcome to Nature's Returns, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Katie Pofall and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Ballot Measures, Leveraging Public Support for Land Conservation. The Nature's Return webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers in the field of conservation finance to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in the growing field of ecosystem service, valuation, and investment. In today's webinar, we will explore opportunities to develop public funding with our speaker, Will Abberger. Will is the Vice President of Conservation Finance for the Trust for Public Land. This program helps state and local governments and citizen groups throughout the United States gauge public support for open space and craft ballot and legislative measures that generate new sources of funding for parks and land conservation. Will has been directly involved in more than 90 local and state land conservation ballot measures and numerous legislative campaigns. Before we begin, we'd like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you might have, and we will direct them to our speaker toward the end of the talk. Please type questions directly into the chat window throughout the presentation. And with that, we welcome Will Abberger to Nature's Returns. Will, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Katie, and thank you to the Yale Center for the Environment and Business for inviting me to make this presentation today. You should see an outline slide on the screen there. We're going to try to cover 4 things here today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the national trends that we see at the Trust for Public Land in terms of public support for funding for land conservation. Talk a little bit about what ballot measures are and the different kinds of ballot measures, and then talk about the steps or the sort of critical components that we've learned about in over 20 years working in this field now, and then wrap up with a case study from Clermont County, Ohio, in the southeastern Ohio, the Cincinnati metropolitan area, that hopefully will pull everything together. And with all of that, our intent is to leave some time for questions at the end. So we're talking about fundamentally about questions that are placed before voters, asking them to dedicate funding of one sort or another for parks and land conservation. People often ask this question about where funding for land conservation in the United States comes from today. And when we think about that, we typically think about the United States Congress and programs like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or perhaps the Farm Bill, that are providing federal funding for conservation. When you look at the actual numbers on where public funding for land conservation in the United States comes from today, the bulk of it actually comes at the state and local level. Nearly 80% of funding in the United States for land conservation is generated by state governments and local governments, counties, cities, towns, villages, and a large bulk of that local and state funding is actually taking place through ballot questions, proposals that are placed before voters, asking them to vote to dedicate funding for parks or conservation. We believe the resounding answer to this question about whether or not it's possible to get voters to raise their taxes and invest in parks and conservation is yes. When American voters are given an opportunity to vote to dedicate funding for parks and conservation, even if it means a tax increase, more times than not, they're saying yes, and they're saying yes in very high proportions. This graph is a little complicated, but I think it's really illustrative of that point. The blue bars you see here is the overall passage rate of park and land conservation ballot measures in a given year. The gray line represents the amount of funding that's generated in that year. And so if you can take a look particularly at, for instance, 2009, 2010, we're entering into the economic recession in the United States. You see that passage rate continues to hold pretty steadily, and if we look at it through the lens of presidential administrations or some of the other major events in our country and really internationally, you see that this 75, 76% passage rate holds true, really across that span of time and across those other events. So 3 out of every 4 ballot measures that are placed before voters asking them to dedicate funding for conservation are approved. This map should be pretty familiar to most people participating in the webinar today. This is, of course, the results of the 2016 presidential election in the United States by state, with the red states being those states that voted for President Trump and the blue states being those states that voted for Secretary Clinton. Now, interestingly, when we lay on top of that, the cities, counties, states, towns where ballot measures also took place in 2016, we see them passing with great regularity in red states and blue states alike. And we believe very strongly at the Trust for Public Land, and I think our experience bears this out, that for American voters, land conservation funding, park funding is not a partisan issue by any stretch. Voters, Democrat, Republican, independent alike, are voting in overwhelming numbers for land conservation. And when we drilled down even a little bit more on the November 2016 election results, the last presidential election, and looked at those counties that had a county land conservation ballot measure on the ballot and voted for Secretary Clinton, and those counties that had a county land conservation measure on the ballot and voted for President Trump, you see that the passage rate in the Trump counties was actually a little bit higher than the passage rate in the Clinton counties. So not a partisan issue in the minds of American voters by any stretch. And we're talking about real money here. You do see some variability here, as you did in that previous graph I showed you, in the amount of funding that's generated in any year, with fewer dollars being generated in odd or off year elections and more funding being generated in even or on year, also known as general elections. That has to do with the overall amount of ballot measure activity that takes place in those years, with less activity in the off years. But we're talking about billions of dollars here. 2014 was in fact a record, as you see there. That's due in large part to 2 very large statewide land conservation measures that were on the ballot, one in Florida and one in New Jersey, where voters were asked to dedicate funds in the state constitution for conservation. The Florida measure alone is projected to generate about $18 billion for land conservation, management, and restoration over the 20-year life of that constitutional amendment. So just taking a snapshot, looking at the last general election, the November 6, 2018 election, there were 57 land conservation measures on the ballot in 21 different states. 49 of those were approved. That's an 86% passage rate. So you see that actually exceeding that historic passage rate of 76%, and about $3.2 billion in new funds for parks and conservation were generated from those 49 ballot measures that were approved. Looking at the most recent election, the November election that took place last fall, as I had previously mentioned, we typically see less activity in an odd or off year election, but 24 of the 30 measures that were on the ballot in November of 2019 were approved, generating about $4.4 billion in new funds for parks and conservation. A large majority of that funding from that the November 2019 election was one ballot measure. Voters in the state of Texas approved Proposition 5, which was a amendment to the Texas state constitution to constitutionally dedicate that portion of the state sales tax revenues that's attributed to the sale of sporting goods to parks and conservation in Texas. That was a $3.4 billion measure. This map of the United States shows where ballot measures have taken place, looking from over the last 10 years, from 1998 to 2018. Anything you see in green on this map is where a ballot measure has passed, whether it's a state, county, or a municipality. The green dots, the sort of pinkish or reddish color there, is where ballot measures have failed at the state, county, or local level. A couple things I would point out here. One, you see a lot of activity in states like Colorado, Florida, New Jersey, and Massachusetts that are pulled out in insets on the side there. Those are all states that have a state source of funding for land conservation that matches local funds. So in Massachusetts, if your town votes to increase its property taxes and adopt what's called the Community Preservation Act in Massachusetts, you're guaranteed a dollar for dollar match from the state of Massachusetts to help achieve your community preservation goals. All of the data I've been showing you here today comes from the Trust for Public Lands Land Vote database. This is a publicly accessible database online that tracks land conservation ballot measures, all land conservation ballot measures in the United States. And you can go to the Land Vote website and log on and look around for maybe what's been happening in your state, or if you're interested, for instance, in bond referenda, where are other places that have done bond referendums, you can search all kinds of things in Land Vote. And so we are the record keepers, and it's a really great source of information. Our conservation finance program at the Trust for Public Land works at the state and local level to generate new funding for parks and conservation. As I said, we've been doing that for about 20 years now. We were involved in about a third of the measures on the ballot in the last general election in 2018, and about 2/3 of the funding. And our passage rate was of ballot measures we are involved in 2018 was 95%. Again, looking at the 2019 election, the last election, we were involved in 8 measures on that ballot. Again, about a third of all the measures across the country, and we're fortunate enough to win all 8. Over the history of our conservation finance program since 1996, we've been involved in more than 570 successful ballot measures, generating about $79 billion in new public funding for parks and conservation. And ballot measures we support enjoy an 82% passage rate. And really, most of the rest of what I'm going to talk about today is how we achieve that 82% passage rate. So shifting away from national trends and now to ballot measure basics. Fundamentally, there are 2 kinds of ballot measures, and these terms are thrown around rather loosely by most people, but there in fact is a legal definition. The most common type of ballot measure is a referendum, and that's where the measure is referred to the ballot by the legislature, whether that's a state legislature or a county commission or a city council. Very common in the eastern United States, in the South, and the Midwest. The other kind of ballot measure is an initiative, and an initiative is where voters collect signatures on a petition and basically are circumventing the legislature to place a measure directly on the ballot themselves. Initiatives are very common in the West, in California, Oregon, Washington State. And as I said, not as common in the East, but those are the 2 basic kinds: initiative, petition, and referendum. Now, this is the most complicated part of the presentation, so this is where I need you to really pay close attention. There are fundamentally 2 steps when we're thinking about putting a measure on the ballot. The first step is getting the measure on the ballot. In the case of a referendum, getting it referred. The second step is getting the voters to say yes. And we found in our work that while the campaign, the getting the voters to say yes part is very important, the most important part is getting the measure on the ballot, and that's typically the most challenging part too. And it's not only getting the measure on the ballot, but what we've learned is you have to get the right measure on the ballot. So what are those key variables that we look at in designing our ballot measure? so that we know we're going to have the very best chance for success when our measure does get on the ballot and gets in front of voters. First is the right funding mechanism. Should it be a sales tax? Should it be a property tax? Should it be a general obligation bond? Should it be some other finance mechanism? Virginia Beach, Virginia actually has a tax on cell phone usage that they use to fund their parks program. So what's the right funding mechanism? Secondly, and very important, is what's the right funding amount? And this is usually a balancing act between what we know are the land conservation needs in our community, and importantly, very importantly, how much voters are willing to pay. Third, among the whole spectrum of things that we might spend funds for land conservation on, whether it's farmland preservation or protecting wildlife habitat or providing new trails or building new parks and ball fields or protecting water quality of rivers, lakes, and streams, what's the most important, what's the most compelling use for funds to voters in our community? Third, and I've talked a little bit about this as you've seen some of the different election choices, when do we want our measure to be on the ballot? What's the best time to be on the ballot? Do we want to be on the ballot in a very high turnout election like the presidential election that we have coming up this fall? Or should we be looking at an election choice at perhaps a municipal election or a special election or a primary election where turnout might be much lower? And then last but certainly not least, it'll probably come as no surprise to you that voters in the United States today fundamentally do not trust the government. And anything we can do to build greater accountability into our ballot measures is going to dramatically enhance our chances for success. So accountability measures might be something like a citizens advisory committee that's going to make recommendations to the county commission about how the funds should be used and what projects should be selected for acquisition, or an annual public audit of how funds are spent. So those kind of accountability measures are typically very compelling to voters. So if we can get the right funding mechanism at the right amount, with the right purposes and uses for funds, on the right ballot, with the right accountability measures, we can dramatically enhance our chances for success when our measure makes it to the ballot. So Katie, I'm gonna pause here before we get into measure components.
All right, for those of you just joining us, we're speaking with Will Abberger about opportunities to develop public financing for conservation. So far, we've covered national trends and the basics of a ballot measure. In the next 10 minutes, Will provide us with the components of a measure and a case study. Then we'll pose questions to Will for our Q&A session, so keep those questions coming.
Okay, so moving along, again, in our experience at the Trust for Public Land working on these ballot measures, we found that there are certain things that you want to make sure you do in every instance. These are also the services that the Trust for Public Lands Conservation Finance programs provide. So what are those key steps that every community that's considering doing this should look at? And really, these are the same things that any good political candidate for office is doing. The fundamental difference obviously being we're seeking to get voters to approve dedicated funding for parks or conservation. The first step is feasibility research. And I'm going to go into each one of these in a little more depth, and then you'll see them in the case study. But this is fundamentally understanding what finance mechanisms are available in our community, how much funding would they generate, and what the impact on voters would be. The second step is to do a poll. We do a lot of polling at the Trust for Public Land, 20 to 30 polls every year in jurisdictions around the country. I know a lot of people have a lot of feelings one way or another about polling, but we still find that they're a very good predictor of how voters might respond to a ballot question. Based on what we've learned in the feasibility research and the results of our poll, we're then able to make a pretty well-informed recommendation about how the measure should be designed. We always call out the actual ballot language as a separate step. Very, very important what the voters actually read when they walk into the voting booth or are casting their ballot early. Getting the ballot language right is typically worth anywhere from 3 to 5 points in your favor in a ballot measure campaign. So those are all about, those first 4 steps are all about getting the measure on the ballot. The final step is, of course, the campaign, getting the voters to say yes. And we're doing all the same kind of things in our ballot measure campaigns that any other good political campaign is doing. So just to talk a little bit more about each one of those, these are typically the things that we're looking at in a feasibility study. Again, this is the first step in our ballot, in our conservation finance methodology. So we're looking at what are those revenue options that are available. We're looking at any kind of open space or park master plans that might have been done in the community. We're looking sort of overall at the city or county or state in terms of where do their revenues come from, what are their expenses, what does their fiscal picture look like. We look at the governmental structure and who are the elected officials, when were they elected, when are they up for election. Importantly, we want to take a pretty close look at what's been on the ballot in the past, whether it's relating to parks or conservation or just any kind of ballot measure and how voters in the community responded to that. And we want to understand what the requirements are for putting a measure on the ballot, and often there are specific requirements for legal requirements for ballot language and how to get to the ballot. And then also, particularly in states where we've done a lot of work, we can look at what other communities have done that have been successful at doing this. So all that gets put together in a report, and it really begins to provide the data we need to make those decisions about ballot measure design. The second step is to poll voters. We work with some of the nation's top pollsters, both Democratic and Republican, and there are quite a few pollsters now who actually specialize in polling on ballot measures and even on conservation ballot measures. We do telephone surveys of voters, testing our ballot question as much as we can anticipate it would look like when it reached the ballot as possible. And the poll fundamentally gives us an idea of whether or not this is something voters in the jurisdiction we're working in would support. Can the measure pass? It also gives us an idea of where land conservation and parks stands in terms of other priorities and other things that might be going on in the community. And then we can begin to look forward to our campaign and test messages that we might use in a yes campaign, folks we might use to deliver those messages, and see how voters respond to that. But really, the poll again provides us with additional data for making those decisions about ballot measure design. We can test different ballot measure amounts. We can test a whole range of different purposes, as well as some of those accountability provisions I talked about in our poll, and learn how voters respond to those. So based on what we learn from the feasibility study and the poll, we're then able to make a pretty well-informed recommendation about how the measure should be designed. What's the right finance mechanism? What's the right amount? What kind of purposes and uses for the fund should be emphasized? When should the measure be on the ballot? And what kind of accountability provisions should it include? The fourth step is about language. Again, this is what you actually read when you cast your ballot, whether you're voting early or you're voting on election day. From our feasibility study, we should know what the legal requirements are. If this is a state where there's a lot of land conservation ballot measure activity, we know what other ballot language has looked like, and we know from our polling what's important to voters. And the ballot language is the only opportunity we have to communicate with every voter who's voting on our ballot measure. And we know from post-election surveys we've done now in several states that voters do actually read the ballot language, and it does make a difference in how they cast their ballot, particularly for those voters who have not made up their mind when they cast their ballot. So getting the ballot language right is very important. Something that if it's left to the lawyers, you can often end up with something that's very unintelligible to the average voter, and a confused voter is typically a no voter. The fifth step is, as I said, is getting the voters to say yes. We're doing all the same kind of things that any political campaign is doing: setting up a campaign committee, developing a campaign plan and budget, figuring out what our strategy is should be, raising money in the community, and then obviously communicating with voters, whether that's through television, radio, or direct mail, or obviously increasingly digital communications. We tend to focus in our ballot measure campaigns on direct mail and on digital, whether that's online or through social media, because we can deliver a targeted message to a targeted group of voters with those tools. Television tends to be prohibitively expensive for most local ballot measure campaigns. And in many of our campaigns, we do have field operations as well, good old-fashioned door knocking to reach voters that way. So hopefully to put all these pieces together briefly, I'm going to go to a case study now. The case study that I wanted to talk to you about is Clermont County, Ohio. This is a county right outside of Cincinnati in southeastern Ohio. Ohio is obviously a swing state. And we were working with a local park district in Clermont County, Ohio. So the first step was our feasibility study. This was prepared by the Trust for Public Lands Conservation Finance research team for Clermont County, Ohio, looking into all those things that I talked about before. And this is really the meat of the feasibility study for Clermont County. The revenue mechanism, finance mechanism that's most often used to fund parks and conservation at the county level in Ohio is the property tax. So what we're looking at here in our feasibility study from Clermont County is different property tax rate increases, the amount of annual revenue that would be generated, and then very importantly, the impact on taxpayers, in this case, homeowners in Clermont County. We know from our work in Ohio and across the country that voters in the United States are generally willing to pay about $20 to $30 in additional taxes for parks and conservation. So we, if you see that, we honed in on this $500,000 increase in the property tax rate, which would generate around $2 million a year for the Clermont County Park District, and would cost the average homeowner in Clermont County about $27 a year in additional property taxes. So our next step was to poll. We actually completed the feasibility study in late 2015, and in February of 2016, we were polling. We interviewed 400 likely November 2016 voters in Clermont County. So we were targeting that November presidential election in 2016. At the very beginning of our poll, we asked the actual ballot question as close as we could approximate it would look like if it made it to the ballot. And we ended up with 59% saying they would vote yes for the ballot measure, and 31% saying they would vote against, with 9% undecided. And you see there, we also want to know what the intensity of that support is. So we have 35% saying they would definitely vote yes, and 19% saying they would definitely vote no. So those are pretty good polling numbers going in. Passage of a property tax increase in Ohio only requires a simple majority. One of the other things we did in our poll is right after that initial ballot test, we told voters that this would only cost them $27 a year. And importantly, right away, you see our support went up by 10 points. from 59% to 69%. So as is typically the case, that idea of a half a mil really didn't mean much to most voters when we explained it to them in terms they could understand. $27 a year for the average homeowner. They realized that it actually wasn't that much money and is something they'd be more likely to support. We tested a variety of different uses for funds. This is two different ways of looking at the idea of park safety, which was an issue that was important to the park district. Interestingly, when we talked about park safety in a general way, we got a higher approval rate at 87% than when we talked about a specific park safety provision, in this case, contracting with the local sheriff to help patrol some of the parks. Still, though, quite strong at 75%, saying that they strongly approved of that use for the funds. Looking at another sort of breakdown on uses for funds, protecting natural areas and wildlife habitat versus acquiring land for new parks. Again, you see a strong preference here among Clermont County voters for protecting land for natural areas and wildlife habitat. So based on what we learned in the feasibility study and the results of our poll, we did recommend to Clermont County the 0.5 or half of 1 mil property tax increase. And this was the ballot language that ultimately ended up on the ballot there in Clermont County. Some of this, for instance, that first line, an additional tax for the Clermont County Park District, is required by law, as is the language at the end at a rate not exceeding 0.5 of 1 mil for each $100 for 10 years, due in calendar year 2017. So that's all legally required in ballot language in Ohio. But you see we have a very clear statement of benefits coming right out of our polling: protecting drinking water, protecting water quality, drinking water, providing nature education for children, protecting natural areas and wildlife habitat to control overdevelopment and limit sprawl, developing and maintaining recreational trails, acquiring land for new and existing parks and trails from willing sellers, which is an accountability provision. And then you can see we also got with all spending subject to routine audits by the state of Ohio as another accountability provision. And we also decided to include a sunset here, limiting the duration of the tax to 10 years. So pretty good ballot language. Our campaign, as I said, we ended up doing quite a bit of direct mail. We had some funding that we could not use for lobbying purposes from a local foundation, but that we could use for public education. So this is an example of some of the public education direct mail that we used in Clermont County. You can see we can talk about the ballot measure. It ended up being issue 15. These are all facts. We can talk about what it would do if it passed. We can talk about the accountability provisions that were included in it. We can alert voters to the fact that it's on the ballot on Tuesday, November 8th. By contrast, this is a advocacy mail piece, a vote yes piece. This one focused on water, as you can see there, and was sent out by our local campaign committee, People for Clermont Parks. So on election day in 2016, we ended up at 63% yes and 37% no. So pretty close to actually what our poll said, certainly within the margin of error of that 59% in our initial ballot test. And getting back to the idea of the fact that this is not a partisan issue by any stretch, Clermont County voted for President Trump at nearly 68% in the November election. So I'm going to wrap up here. Would be very pleased to talk to anyone who's on the webinar today, be interested in learning more about working with us on a ballot measure in your community or state. Fundamentally, you've got to have a compelling purpose. The proposal has to be affordable. The voters have to trust the local government or the state government to spend the money the way they say they're going to, and you have to have a good campaign. And if you can put those pieces together, you can very likely be successful in generating new funding for parks and conservation in your community. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Will. That was really informative and very interesting. And we have some questions from our participants here. So I'll just jump right in. Our first question is from Gerben, and he asks, how does TEPL go about monitoring legislation that is pending in state or local government? Do you have any suggestions for people who want to stay up to date on what ballot measures are being proposed?
So in the Land Vote database, you'll find a report there on upcoming elections. So that's certainly in one place as we monitor ballot measures across the country, and we learn that they've actually been referred to the ballot or made it to the ballot via initiative petition. Those will be listed at the Land Vote website. Ballotpedia is another really great source of information. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular website and service, but they also track ballot measures across the country. In states where the Trust for Public Land has an office or where we're very active working on ballot measures, in Florida, for instance, where I am, you can just call us and we have a really good idea of what's going on for elections that are coming up soon. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks, Will. Our next question is from Lena. Lena asks, are you seeing strong support for protecting nature as a climate resilience strategy? And does the public make that connection? And if you could just speak more broadly about how climate issues are relating in ballot measures today and how you're seeing this theme come through, that would be great.
Yeah, great question. My answer to that question 10 years ago or even 5 years ago would have been no, but that's changing. Public attitude, public awareness and voter awareness about climate change is certainly increasing. And we are increasingly incorporating climate related issues into our ballot measures. We worked on a ballot measure in 2018 in Chaffee County, Colorado. Just west of Denver in the Front Range there, where controlling wildfires, which are in part a result of the changing climate there, was a major issue for Chaffee County voters, and providing funding for better forest management, actually on national forest land in Chaffee County, was a big part of the funding that's come from that successful measure. Coming up in 2020, I think we'll see a number of ballot measures that have a climate focus, whether that's towards resiliency or towards mitigation. Some of you may be aware that Governor Cuomo in New York has proposed a $3 billion environmental bond in New York, and much of that funding would be directed toward resiliency. State of Rhode Island is also considering bonds for the 2020 ballot, which would also contain a substantial funding towards resiliency in Rhode Island, particularly as a coastal state deals with sea level rise there. So definitely climate change is coming up, and the impacts of climate change and solutions that can be funded in our ballot and legislative work. It's not the case everywhere, but it's a growing trend, I would say.
Well, so our next question is if you can comment on extending current funding measures that will be expiring. And I take it that this question might come from someone who's got an existing ballot measure that has perhaps a sunset clause. So could you speak to actions that you'd suggest for folks to take in that regard?
Yes. Extending funding for an existing program is usually much easier than creating a new program, particularly if that land conservation program has developed a good track record on the ground and has demonstrated success, and that the funds that voters previously approved were spent well. We are working on a number of renewals in different communities around the country, and we've seen some communities. A really good example is Beaufort County, South Carolina. On the coast there in South Carolina, just south of Charleston, has gone back to the voters for 5 successive bond referenda dating back to 2000, every one of which has been approved by Beaufort County voters. So yes, renewal is a much easier. Typically, you can also with make the argument to voters that it's a tax that they're already paying, so it's not a tax increase to continue the program.
I think that's an important issue for folks that may already have this type of funding available. A follow-up question on that, does that require the same amount of funding, and can you speak to sort of the cost for these measures?
Generally, yes. I think in all cases we want to do our homework. So even if we're looking at a renewal, we probably want to go back and do the kind of feasibility research. I would certainly say we'd want to do a public opinion survey. The steps that I talked about in our conservation finance methodology are still important. The political environment could have changed in the community. There may be other competing ballot measures that we weren't dealing with in a previous election. So I don't think there's a big difference in the cost. You might be able to get away with a little bit less in terms of your campaign. But again, when we're working on ballot measures, we want to make sure we're doing absolutely everything we can to see them pass. And so the more we can communicate with voters, the better.
Thanks, Will. So our next question comes from Charlie, and he asks, what has TPL's experience been nationally, or perhaps there's data that helps demonstrate this, on conservation ballot measure opposition versus partnership with the real estate industry? In his experience, in some cases, this has been a barrier in certain communities, so he's curious to learn more about that perspective nationally.
Yeah, another very insightful question, Charlie. The death knell for any ballot measure, particularly if it's a tax increase, is paid organized opposition. I can count on one hand the number of ballot measures we've won where we had paid organized opposition. And so what we're seeking to do in our ballot measure design and in our ballot measure campaign is to try to eliminate any opposition. So oftentimes that comes down to the selection of the finance mechanism. If we know, for instance, as was the case in North Dakota in 2014, that an excise tax on oil and gas drilling is going to meet with strong and well-funded opposition from the oil and gas industry, that might not be the best choice for us. We want to seek to build as broad a coalition as we can in support of our ballot measure. And if we can reach out to all segments of the community we're working in, including realtors, home builders, the Chamber of Commerce, local financial institutions, local businesses, the business owners, we can build a broad coalition in support of our ballot measure. That's one of the best ways to guarantee success. Specifically, just to drill down a little bit more on the realtors, when we're looking at a real estate transfer tax, that's something that, as a matter of policy, the national realtors will oppose any new real estate transfer tax anywhere if that's your finance mechanism. But we've had some success in New York State, where under the New York Community Preservation Act, some towns have been authorized and able to fund their land conservation programs through a real estate transfer tax, and have been able to build bridges with the realtors to help secure voter support for those ballot measures.
Will, could you speak a little bit more about a real estate transfer tax? And generally, Charlie had a follow-up with speaking specifically on just annual property tax-based measures.
Yeah, of course. So the most common finance mechanisms for parks and conservation at the local level in the United States are the property tax, or a local sales tax, or some kind of borrowing, generally, usually a general obligation bond. So those are what we call the big three. Bonds tend to pass with a higher rate than property taxes or sales taxes, but they all have enjoyed pretty high passage rates. The real estate transfer tax, a tax on real estate transactions, is a finance mechanism that's available in some places. For instance, I mentioned New York State, where that is the finance mechanism under the New York Community Preservation Act. It also happens to be the finance mechanism for the state land conservation programs here in Florida. And again, essentially, it's a tax on real estate transfers. And so one of the disadvantages of the real estate transfer tax is it does tend to fluctuate with the economy, with real estate sales. So one of the problems we encountered here in Florida with funding for our state land conservation programs was during the real estate recession, when real estate activity slowed down dramatically, those real estate transfer tax revenues declined dramatically.
All right, and then our next question here is, ballot measures can seem risky for an organization with a small budget. How do you suggest smaller organizations work toward public financing?
We work with, and worked in a lot of very small towns with very much grassroots type organizations in those communities. And there's a lot that you can do as a smaller organization that doesn't require a cash investment. Certainly, volunteering on a campaign committee is a commitment of time, but something that could be very important. Communicating with your friends and neighbors, other voters, via the internet, email, or through your social media channels is also can be really valuable in a ballot measure campaign. So there are lots of things that can be done. Going out and speaking to groups in a community about the ballot measure and what it's going to do, and asking them to vote yes, are all things that are not terribly expensive in terms of money, certainly are in terms of time, but can make a big difference in a ballot measure campaign. So there are lots of ways that smaller organizations can be involved and make a big difference in winning or losing.
Thanks, Will. And then our next question here, are you aware of any campaigns that successfully engaged all subsets of voters, including minority and underserved communities? What strategies or tools did they use?
Yes, definitely. And one of the things that we found in working on these ballot measures is that support is typically higher for our park and land conservation ballot measures among voters of color than it is among white voters. And where those populations of voters, Hispanic voters, African American voters, other ethnic groups make up a sizable portion of the electorate, we're definitely reaching out to them and targeting them with our communications in the campaign. A great example of that is the city of New Brunswick, New Jersey, where we had a measure on the ballot in November of 2019. There's a large and active Hispanic population in New Brunswick, and this measure was actually establishing an open space trust fund with a 1% property tax levy in the city. Was strongly supported by them, and we worked with a number of community-based organizations, including New Brunswick Tomorrow, to get the word out among Hispanic voters, and actually ended up doing some of our communications, both in terms of print advertising and direct mail in Spanish as well as English, targeted to those Hispanic voters. So very much so, equity is a real focus at the Trust for Public Land for us as an organization, and also in our ballot measure work.
And Will, can you speak to how to select the content of a ballot measure? If you want to make that measure more specific towards the needs of certain communities, how you would fit that into your measure? Yeah,
so part of that is understanding what the needs are in the community. Again, in New Brunswick, we had done quite a bit of work outside of our ballot measure work, looking at the state of the city's park program and park facilities. Many of them were quite in disrepair, and many of those parks that were in the worst shape were in the neighborhoods of those Hispanic voters. So a big focus of the New Brunswick measure will be improving those existing parks. And we knew that was an issue going in. It was also an issue we identified in our polling that was important to New Brunswick voters, and so was built right into the ballot question.
Well, I think that brings us to a close for our webinar today. And that concludes this talk. So again, our webinar was Ballot Measures, Leveraging Public Support for Conservation Finance. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Will for joining us today. Thank you so much for your insight onto this really important topic. We have recorded this webinar, and so we ask that you visit the Events tab on the Yale Center for Business and Environment's website. You can also access the recording through the Yale iTunes University podcast. And please be sure to register for our next webinar on Monday, March 2nd, for a discussion on watershed finance models with Ashley Allen Jones of I2 Capital and Spencer Meyer of the Highstead Foundation. So again, thank you all for joining us, and thanks to our speaker, Will Abberger from the Trust for Public Land. Until next time, this is Katie Pofall from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment.